in anthropology, one of the emerging areas, I mean, one of the nice things about anthropology, is, of course, is there are constantly new areas emerging, or old areas get revived in some way. I mean, I remember as a student, we used to talk about something in those days we called human ecology, which was really, in a way, about human-animal relationships, but from the point of view of like herding peoples, or pastoralists, hunter-gatherers, and all those kind of classical anthropological kind of categories. Yeah. Since then, I think the field has moved, and the field has moved in extremely interesting directions that of a kind exactly that I want us to discuss a little bit tonight. It might seem to be a rather new idea, but I hope that's the point, in a way, is to open up some fresh ideas for discussion. One of the areas that's begun seriously to emerge in anthropology is indeed the question of human-animal relationships. Now, this has taken a number of forms. Oh, here we are. Here's the, okay, let me see. We're new thinking, thank you. And even plant animal, that may seem strange. You know, when you talk about this, sometimes people accuse you of being, when I was a student, people would say, are you a tree hugger? You know, you were one of those kind of people who sort of talk to plants. Our new King Charles of England is supposed to be a person who talks to his plants, right? And this has always seemed for many people to be a kind of slightly marginal, bizarre kind of activity. But I think the situation has changed. The situation has changed in two interesting directions. Now, again, here in India, for example, in Indian anthropology, there's been quite a lot of interest in human-animal relationships from a very practical point of view. In the Indian Himalayas, for example, there's been work on the Indian Himalayas, there's been a lot of work on the fact that farmers lose their goats, for example, to leopards. They get their fields dug up by wild boars, and that's raised questions of how humans relate to the animals that share their particular biosphere, and indeed, quite practical legal questions. For example, should there be systems of compensation, which indeed there are in India, for people who've lost, say, cattle, goats, whatever, to wild animals that inhabit their, the same sort of zone of interest that they do. Of course, there's some obviously clash of interest there. That's okay. And I mean, that itself is a very important area. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, okay? Where the debate is extended itself is into the very interesting question of interspecies communication. Now, any of us all of us have contact with animals. If we have pets, of course, we have intensive and intimate conversations with those animals. Sometimes this may be a rather anthropocentric kind of thing. We treat them as if they were little humans, assume they understand what we're talking about. In fact, of course, any intelligent animal understands a great deal, though they may not understand language in the same sense that human beings are using it. That is not to say that they are not able to communicate both with us and indeed with one another, or indeed between species in interspecies communication. Now, very, very interesting emerging work is happening in all of these areas, including indeed in the human-plant relationship, or indeed between plants and plants, or between plants and animals, which may seem a strange idea. It was for many people a bizarre idea. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, it was only a few years ago that a Canadian scholar came up with this idea of what is now being called the wood wide web. Are you familiar with that idea? The wood wide web. Began to realize that, in fact, plants communicate with each other. For example, trees have intensive forms of communication with each other. This can happen through their root systems and their relationships to fungi and other species living in the soil beneath them. It can occur through the release of aromatic oils and phenoms and so on that will alert other trees to possibility of attack by insects, aphids, or something like this. And this has been even discovered to be the question with other kinds of plants as well, which raises fascinating philosophical questions, right? Because it's not apparent that plants, for example, have minds in the sense that either humans or animals do. But a number of very, very interesting recent work has suggested that they do in some quite different distributed sense from the way in which human beings have minds. Just to quote two of those examples. For example, we've all heard these stories about your plants loving Mozart, but hating acid rock. They withdraw if you play them loud rock music, but they love classical music. There's in fact no scientific evidence for this at all. I'm sorry. Okay, if you want to spend your time playing Mozart to your plant, by all means do, but as no clear sign that it will have any effect on their behavior. However, it is known that plants, lettuces, for example, quite innocent-looking plants, are aware of the approach of predators, for example, caterpillars, and will communicate the approach of caterpillars to other plants in their vicinity. And in the case of plants which have any kind of toxic defense against infestation of some kind, will activate that. So, in other words, your plants can hear a caterpillar coming, but they may not be able to hear Mozart. Okay, they don't apparently have ears. They don't apparently have minds in the same sense that human beings do. Nevertheless, they are clearly able to communicate with each other and to alert other plants of their own species to the possibility of predators or some other danger approaching. Okay, a similar study has been done to discover whether plants have memory. Now, all of us are probably familiar, for example, with this little plant that if you touch it, it folds up. We used to love this when we were kids. We used to go to the fields and deliberately go around touching those. What do they call mimosa? Because they would fold up, and if you left them alone for a few minutes, their leaves will open again. Okay, first experiment was done to discover whether mimosa are simply responding to a physical stimulus, being touched, trodden on, even high wind or something of this kind. The experiment involved taking mimosa and dropping them. The first few times that mimosa were dropped in experimental condition, they of course did this. They closed up, as most of us would done if we were dropped from what to a human being would be maybe 10 feet or something like this. It would be a rather scary experience for us too. They would shut. After 5, 6, or 7 drops of this kind, when they were dropped, they knew what was going on. They knew that there was no danger involved in this process of their being dropped. They were in an experimental situation. They no longer closed. They stayed open. Okay. Now I say we won't get into the philosophical questions here. They're extremely interesting in relation to plants, and of course in relation to animals, which also are apparently far from us in the kind of spectrum of nature. For example, a lot of work has been done on the octopus. The octopus apparently has a distributed brain. It's not just in its head, although indeed they do have heads. It's distributed across their body, and they can respond in ways to different stimuli. They can change color. They can do all sorts of things. They can respond to predators and so on. And they are, in fact, able to undertake intelligent decisions without apparently having a mind or communication system of the kind that we would recognize amongst humans, of course, or amongst those kind of species that either we have the most interaction with, say cats and dogs, or species which appear to be biologically close to us, like the higher apes, monkeys, chimpanzees, for example, these kind of animals who do appear to be like us and with whom we share quite a large amount of our genetic code, particularly with the higher apes, for example. We share over 90% of our genetic code with chimpanzees, for example, not with dogs and cats, perhaps, but to a much lesser extent. Okay, so this growing recognition of issues around interspecies communication has given rise to lots of emerging themes, and I've listed some of them. I'm sure there are others, and they're all fascinating. But here are, I think, some of the major ones, right? The first is the field of bio or environmental ethics, which is, of course, collectively the question of our treatment of non-human species. Should you be cruel to animals? How should you treat animals of any kind? Can we assume that they feel pain? Even fish, they seem to be very, very distant from us biologically, clearly have senses and do indeed suffer, okay, if subjected to unpleasant stimulus. There's a whole field here, of course, which is extremely important, I think, at the moment because of the environmental crisis. It does force us to think about our relationship to nature in widespread sense. So in this case, it could be not only the question of other animal species, it could be to nature in a very broad sense. I mean, how do we respond to if there's a mountain in the way of our mining activity? Should we, in fact, dig up the mountain? Or should we leave the mountain alone because the mountain itself has certain rights, as it were, to be left alone and to remain as part of the total biosphere without human interference of the kind that's going to fundamentally change its character and nature? Now, some thinking in environmental ethics is very pragmatic, right? If we might destroy a mountain, not realizing that a mountain is, in fact, a major actor in environmental control, particularly in things in relation of rainfall or wind patterns, for example. Having got rid of the mountain, we discovered that rainfall patterns change not to our favor because we did not realize its role in the total geography. So, of course, there are many of these kind of practical issues, and often the same practical issues come up about the destruction of natural habitats, of jungles, for example, because they do or might contain medicinal plants, the properties of which we haven't yet discovered, which could indeed be very positive from the point of view of human health. But those are utilitarian issues, right? They focus essentially on our interests. Other issues that have come up are a little more subtle in some ways, including, of course, this very fascinating question of, does nature or certain species, qualities of nature, in fact, have rights in a way which is parallel to the notion of human rights? And should those rights be respected, their habitat left undisturbed, for example, because they have as much right to existence and life in that natural habitat as we do. And the fact that we have the power to disturb those habitats does not mean that we should disturb those habitats. So the whole question of the rights of nature as parallel to the question of human rights is, again, another fascinating question. We take a whole session perhaps to talk about that too. There's the very interesting philosophical issue of responsibilities to future generations. If you remember the old famous Brundtland report definition of sustainability, this was what, 30, 40 years ago now, right? Was indeed the idea that the idea of sustainability is that we should not take from the environment things that would impose negative consequences on future generations. Although we do not know what exactly the interests or desires of future generations would be, we should nevertheless assume that many of those qualities that any future generation within the foreseeable future would have would be much like ours. They have the right to a decent environment, they have the right to clean water, they have the right to good air, they have the right to habitats which are aesthetically pleasing, and so on. They have all those kind of things. Now, again, there's obviously a philosophical debate about this. Future generations don't yet exist, and we cannot indeed know precisely what their interests would be. Nevertheless, the precautionary principle does suggest that since we can assume certain things about the needs of future generations, and they may not be so future, they might be our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, whose life we can, in fact, imagine. In fact, we might very well share. If our children or our children's children have children, we would, in fact, be alive at the same time as a generation ahead of us, and is going to experience the consequences, for example, of the kind of climate change which is human-induced at the present moment. There are notions of human selfhood. These are very philosophical questions. What makes us human? People often in the past used to argue that one of the factors that make us human was the possession of language. If, in fact, it can be shown that other species have complex languages, different, certainly, from human languages, but to assume that languages have to follow the same kind of patterns as human language is a highly anthropocentric assumption, to agree, right? If whales can communicate, for example, in complex ways, there's no need to assume that their form of vocabulary, their grammar, if you like, is necessarily in any way parallel to that of human species. Sometimes I think this is where it's quite worth reading science fiction sometimes, because sometimes science fiction does, this is purely imaginative, allow us to imagine beings which have a very different sense of selfhood from the sense that we have. But one of those elements is indeed, as many people are now arguing, that human selfhood requires the presence of other species. If we could imagine living in a world with no other animals, it would be not only denuded in the sense that we wouldn't have pets, we wouldn't have any kind of animal species to even go and look at in a zoo. It would be a much deeper effect on us than that. It would be extremely negative psychologically than other forms, because in fact we need nature. And indeed, some people now are talking about this in very specifically health terms, in terms of the nature deficit syndrome. That's to say that people deprived of fairly extensive and systematic contact with nature have a much wider range of psychological, possibly physical, and even other effects. For example, that I don't think that evidence is yet detailed enough to prove this, but that crime is related to nature deficit. People who are widely exposed to nature are less likely to perform, to undertake the kind of criminal activity which unfortunately is all too common in urban societies, for example, where precisely are the settings when people are probably cut off from very much in the way of systematic contact with nature. Oh, could we have the next slide, please? I don't seem to be able to change it myself. Can we have the next slide?
Yes.
Can we have the next slide?
We have changed. We have changed the slide.
No, I'm still on the. It says new thinking in human animal relationships. I need the next one. The following slide, please.
Yes, I am requesting Randhir to do these slides, please. I'm just calling him. Maybe he has just some technical problem. Okay. Hello, Randhir. I'm just calling him.
Okay, thank you. So we need the next. That's the one. Thank you very much. Now, talking about bioethics, it's not too difficult. I mean, there are lots of interesting practical, philosophical, and potentially policy issues there, but that's not the theme for today, of course, to talk about bioethics, important as that is in the context of talking about aesthetics as well. The issue of environmental aesthetics has indeed emerged now as a branch of aesthetics in the philosophical sense, okay? And what environmental aesthetics refers to are the kind of issues that are there on the screen for you. For example, the aesthetics of landscape. Why do we find certain kinds of landscapes attractive, others less attractive? And indeed, many of you will know the very famous study which was done some years ago when an experimental group was shown pictures of different kinds of landscapes and were asked to evaluate them in terms of what kind of landscape they preferred. And what that research showed was very interesting, that the majority of people preferred a landscape that was a kind of savanna, relatively open, with trees and with water. And one of the explanations for that, whether it's a valid explanation or not, I can't really judge, was the argument that in fact the reason we prefer savanna-like landscape is that was the kind of landscape in which humans originally evolved. And amongst the reasons why we like it and why we successfully evolved in the savanna is that it gives us lots of space, it gives us plenty of sight line. We could see dangerous animals or dangerous other humans approaching. And we don't like dark forest landscapes because they precisely are the kind of landscapes in which we cannot see beyond a very short distance, and therefore are vulnerable to any kind of attack by, again, wild animals, other humans, whatever dangerous elements there were in that thing. Whereas savanna is a much pleasanter and aesthetically satisfying, but also an environment in which human safety is much more liable to be achieved than in a, say, forest or highly mountainous environment. It's the same way, of course, we often have ideas about animal beauty. Why we think a leopard or some other animal is, aesthetically very, very lovely. And of course, we make these judgments, I guess, in choosing a dog or cat or other pet, we would make the same kind of decision in choosing what kind of animal we want to live with on a daily basis. There are apparently people who like ugly animals, but that, of course, itself is an aesthetic judgment. Pit bulls and animals like this, which in some places are actually banned now because they are aggressive as well as not particularly beautiful to look at. Now, bioaesthetics, we should distinguish from environmental aesthetics, okay? Environmental aesthetics, therefore, is that aesthetics of natural beauty, whether in forms of landscape, animals, water, cloud, sky, any of the embodiments of nature. Bioaesthetics is something else, raises a different set of questions. And here are the main ones, I think. Now, the first question is, of course, is why as a species, we make aesthetic judgments at all? Well, why do we have to be so concerned about whether a particular animal, person, landscape is somehow visually or orally, whatever, more attractive to us than another landscape? Well, why don't we find, destroyed landscapes destroyed by mining and other things like this as beautiful as say, again, the savanna, forest, the rolling nature, all these kind of situations, okay? This has raised the question of, first of all, is whether therefore aesthetics is actually rooted in our biological nature. It's not simply a cultural add-on, which has appeared late in human civilization, but is in a sense built in. No, it's okay, slide. The next slide, we're coming in a minute. This is the second slide, okay? Archaeological studies do, in fact, again, provide some evidence for this, as we know. Cave paintings have been discovered going back millennia, suggesting that our very, very, very early ancestors were, in fact, concerned with making aesthetic, with aesthetic expression, making aesthetic judgments themselves, even if they themselves were related to very practical things like hunting, the qualities of different animal species. But then that's true of our art today. So that doesn't in any way disqualify early so-called Stone Age art or cave art and so on as being as aesthetically interesting as forms of contemporary art. There's the second question of whether non-human species have a sense of beauty. Now, we know that many non-human species are, by human standards, very beautiful. And this has caused evolutionary biologists quite a lot of trouble. Darwin famously said that the tail of the peacock, I can't remember the exact words he used in The Origin of the Species, so it basically drove him crazy. So what's it for? Okay, so it's for attracting female peahens, right? The peacock can, wave his tail and dance around in front of potential girlfriends and so on. If this works, he will indeed find a mate. So yes, okay, up to a point, it does have some practical role to be more beautiful. But once you extend this from, say, something more obvious like the peacock to other kinds of animals, why are so many bird species so extremely beautiful? When, in fact, we've lost the screen again. Sorry, can we have the slide back? Can we get the slide back?
Yes, Randhir, can you please put it? Yes, I think.
Yes, please stay alert. Yes, if you could stay alert. Sorry. Now, this is always a fascinating question. Do animals have a sense of species? Do they make art? Now, if we see a bird doing it's making its a bird song, for example, it may have certain practical functions, attracting a mate, alerting people, but a lot of bird song seems to be just for fun. Birds like to sing, okay, and they're not having any particular, utilitarian outcome of that singing. They like music, okay. And there have been a number of studies that suggested that in some cases, yes, one of the most famous cases is that of the Australian bowerbird. Now, the bowerbird is very, very interesting for several reasons. The male bowerbirds make nest-like structures, often very elaborate. In fact, most environmental artists would admire them, I think, as amazing works of art in themselves, which they decorate. They go around looking for colored objects, pebbles, any form of bright plastic, anything that human beings might have left at a picnic site, for example, bits of glass, or beads or anything like this. They decorate their bowers. And then again, like the peacock, they invite potential mates, female bowerbirds, to come and admire the quality of their artistic creation. So they clearly do have a sense of creativity, and different. And if all bowerbirds did the same kind of design, again, we would assume this was a simple evolutionary function. All bowerbirds set out their colored beads and so on in the same pattern, and that is what female bowerbirds responded to. Is not the case. If you look at different birds, every male bowerbird decorates his bower differently. They have quite different aesthetic senses. Okay. Furthermore, the bowerbird, and again, if you know of other cases, please alert me to this. It's the only case that I know of an animal that paints. It turns out that female bowerbirds, for some reason, are particularly fond of the color blue, which does not necessarily exist in many cases naturally in the Australian desert or semi-desert, okay? What the male bowerbirds do is they find a particular kind of berry which yields a blue dye. I mean, many berries, mulberries, for example, produce a dark red dye, okay? I can't remember the name of this particular berry, but it produces a blue dye. They harvest these berries, take them back to their bower, open them up, and they paint non-blue objects blue, so that when they can attract, again, a potential mate, they can show her not only their other collection of red, green, yellow, orange, shiny, whatever they have, but particularly the blue objects, which they've created specially as a form of attraction for them. Again, if you know of any other animal that paints, it's known, for example, that if a chimpanzee is given a pencil and put in front of a piece of paper on which maybe 2/3 of a circle have been drawn, in many cases, the chimpanzee will complete the circle. They have a sense of form, but I'm not sure they actively paint. If given paint boxes and so on, well, maybe they would, but I don't think it's occurred to them to create paints and dyes in the way which the bowerbird has done to actually spontaneously create art in that sense. Okay, this has raised the interesting question of whether aesthetics has an evolutionary role, whether it does in fact play a role in the evolutionary process, which is on the whole thought of as primarily a biological process. Okay, and we see many examples of this, and on the next slide too. I mean, for example, many studies of, can we go back? Oh, can we go back for a moment? No, can we go back? Thank you. Just for these last couple of many studies which call themselves bioesthetic studies have had to do with things like the fact that in human dance, music forms, performance styles, myths, fairy tales, our toys, and so on, we mimic we either represent animals, other natural forms, or we in fact copy them to some extent. In certain architectural forms, for example, we might indeed, if not copy in precise form, styles which in fact we've derived from natural forms, okay? If you remember fairy tales of your childhood, for example, we know they're populated with animals, right? They talk, they do stuff, you know. As children, we often go to sleep with our teddy bear, right? Although bears, in fact, are not terribly friendly animals. Our culture is, in fact, permeated with motifs and forms that we've drawn from nature. We have not simply invented those forms without any reference to forms which already exist in nature. And this may, as some people suggested, even apply to things like body grooming. You know, why do we want to cut our hair in certain ways? Why do we want to brush it in certain ways, or dye it, or have, you know, hang things from our ears? Or why do we find certain body shapes, human body shapes, more attractive than others? Now, this may indeed, of course, have evolutionary form. Reason we might choose the body shape of a potential mate on the grounds that he or she looks like the kind of partner who will in fact produce healthy, active children, okay? Nevertheless, it doesn't obviously stop there. If that was all that ideas of human beauty involved, I think the cosmetic industry, for example, wouldn't have that much to do, because that only affecting the kind of, how do we put it, the epiphenomenon of the body shape, not its fundamental shapes and structures. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So the debate so far is taken up to a number of these questions, whether there is a biological evolutionary origin of aesthetics, that it is in a sense coded into us in the same kind of way that Noam Chomsky has argued that the ability to perform language is coded. It's, although we learn individual languages, the ability to learn languages is genetically coded. Whether the same is therefore true of aesthetic appreciation. Of course, as with the peacock, for example, or indeed as with our friend the bowerbird, there is clearly, as Darwin pointed out, an element of sexual selection here. To attract the desired mate often involves performing, demonstrating something, demonstrating, in this case, aesthetic abilities as a way of making, you know, yourself attractive to that potential mate. So that is certainly the truth. Other factors too. The domestication of animals and the way in which we have in fact succeeded in either domesticating animals, or as some wits like to argue, they've domesticated us, sorry. You know, that for us, a cat, we think we've domesticated our cats, and our cats think of us probably as terribly domesticated creatures that they can exploit to make sure they are fed, groomed, you know, petted, and all those kind of things. So domestication of animals and the way in which we communicate with animals that we now refer to as pets is interesting. But there are other elements that are part of nature, of course, but which don't necessarily involve quite the same kind of issues. For example, cuisine. Cuisine is interesting because, of course, if we wanted to, I believe there is something called the paleo diet, which certain dieters believe in. And I think the paleo diet, as its name suggests, is supposed to be as close to a kind of Stone Age diet as we can get. Well, if that is fine with you, by all means do it. I personally prefer a rather bigger range of cuisine than simply eating what our Stone Age ancestors. But there's no need to do this, okay? You know, at least minimum health could be maintained with a very basic diet, and we're aware of what the essential nutrients are. Beyond that, we don't have to go. But in fact, we found, of course, cuisine itself is now one of the major art forms of human culture. In fact, we think of cultures often in those ways, cultures having an elaborated cuisine as part of their cultural makeup, the very qualities which we admire in those cultures. That art has to do with expression, emotion, externalization. The fact that song and vocalization seems to be a universal. The fact that there are languages beyond human languages. You suggested almost all animal species, and possibly including plants, have some form of language. And of course, again, the problem that Darwin struggled with of display. Why is it necessary for animals, say some animal species, to be so beautifully decorated when that does not apparently have any obvious evolutionary function, or in fact might be dangerous because it attracts attention to you. If you can't camouflage yourself, this makes you vulnerable again to potential predators. Next slide, please. Thank you. So it seems that indeed aesthetic expression is very ancient and possibly biologically rooted. As far as debate about art is concerned, frankly, I couldn't care less. I don't know if this bothers you. I mean, if aesthetic appreciation is biologically rooted, well, that's fine. I mean, lots of things are biologically rooted, like hunger. But the fact that we have hunger as a biological trait does not explain the huge variation in human dietary preferences, which we're aware of. In fact, we enjoy, right, as a cultural good. This has led people into some rather complex areas, which we won't touch on today, including the field of neuroaesthetics, which is trying to discover how aesthetic appreciation is realized and processed in the brain, in the same way that neuroscientists have been trying to discover unsuccessfully so far. Whereas memory, for example, okay, it appears that memory is a distributed function. It's not simply one spot in the brain that is the point at which memory is stored in some way. We're aware that there are things which attract us, certain kinds of vocalization, body shape, facial symmetry, and as we've said, parallels in things like human, and things like animal coloring, bird plumage, and song, which again seem to be forms of aesthetic expression which are not necessary according to any kind of narrow biological explanation. Architecture, of course, is something which has become a major human quality of human cultures, which of course creates safety, shelter, intimacy, sense of power. If we want to have an elaborate kind of building which we want to impress other people with, all of these things themselves add up to the fact that indeed, aesthetic expression does indeed appear to be a cultural universal, and is in one of those things shared with other species. And indeed, some sense of order and symmetry appears in fact to be one of those qualities that most animal species like ourselves, in fact, do have senses of form, and they will behave in such ways as to create in their own environment a sense of tidiness. Okay, next slide, please. The Prudens Thesis. The Prudens Thesis. Now, one of the scholars whose name I would alert you to, who's written quite a lot about this whole question of animals and beauty and our own relationship to ourselves and natural beauty, in a book published fairly recently in 2017, The Evolution of Beauty, How Darwin's Forgotten Theory of Mate Selection Shapes the Animal World and Us. Okay, so in that book, Prudden, who is actually an ornithologist, this is his primary field, is birds, okay? In fact, I don't know why Darwin's theory was forgotten. I don't think it was forgotten. If you read The Origin of Species, it's quite clearly there. Was indeed this question of the fact that although aesthetic qualities appear to be unnecessary, they do have a role in a number of things, including mate selection, okay? And again, as with the bowerbird, as with the peacock, as with other species which use their physical quality, their physical beauty, or their ability to organize objects in a beautiful way as a means through which mate selection takes place. And of course, we could argue that, we do the same in certain ways, not only in the sense of the aesthetics of the body and the way we would attempt to enhance that, whatever body shape we have, with working out, going to the gym, makeup, hairstyles, body decoration in the form of jewelry, body piercing, tattoo, and all these other rather interesting, sometimes inscrutable qualities of human self-decoration. Now, Prudens has a definition of aesthetics, so the aesthetic domain. What he goes, this is his definition, okay? So art consists of a form of communication that co-evolves with its own evaluation, including, which he goes on, not in that immediate quote, in the following sentence or two, he talks about including the role of artists and their audiences. Now, there are two interesting important ideas there, I think. One is this idea of the artist form communication, and the other is that, of course, it co-evolves in a feedback situation, which is why, of course, we evaluate the art of previous eras differently than the way we would evaluate contemporary art. If you're a contemporary artist, you're probably not going to go and paint like Renoir or someone, however technically wonderful Renoir's painting is, okay, simply because it's gone out of, it's no longer a contemporary taste, okay? That the art itself has evolved as a complex feedback mechanism has also evolved. And that art is therefore, there's no single possible definition of aesthetics or of art because it's a moving target. And with the emergence of technology, digital art and things like this, of course, we see that kind of evolution happening. And as it evolves, of course, new forms of art criticism are necessary to confront it and to interpret it, to debate it, okay? He argues, in fact, therefore, that what we're talking about is not a causal process, that some kind of evolutionary mechanism has caused the production of aesthetic qualities or of art, the things we produce, that there's actually a complex interplay of biological and cultural evolution. And in fact, the example of food that we talked about earlier is one of these. One of the scholars who wrote considerably about this some 30, 40 years ago, this was Norbert Elias, who wrote about what he called the civilizing process, in which as civilizations themselves evolve culturally, they do in fact expand their range of cultural artifacts, and they begin to modify their behavior in ways in which is thought to be more culturally appropriate. I'm sure, well, usually I eat vegetarian food anyway, but I'm sure if I go into any restaurant in Delhi and eat my chicken and simply throw the bones over my shoulder onto the floor or into the environment of fellow diners, I'm going to get ejected from the restaurant pretty quickly, right? Though that's in fact exactly what medieval diners did. If you ever have the pleasure of going to Shakespeare's house in Stratford-upon-Avon in England, all sorts of objects and artifacts, which I whether they were his or not, but they date from that Elizabethan period of there. And one which always struck me, I remember going there as a school kid, the kind of place we'd go on school trips, was the plates. A wooden platter, which after you ate your first course off one side, then you licked it clean, and you simply turned it over and ate the second course off the other side. Saves the washing up, right? But I think that would be considered rather gross behavior again in any contemporary dining situation, okay? Which, in other words, Elias's theory is indeed one about the interplay of biological and cultural factors in the way in which human civilizations have evolved, if you like that phrase, from not necessarily more basic, but have become elaborated codes in ways that were not accessible to our ancestors. So I'm going to wrap up quite soon. Prudens also is involved, this is not my term, this is a term I think probably invented by Richard Prudens, what he calls biotic art. Art which is produced by animals and plants, as with the bowerbird painting objects blue to please potential girlfriends, but which she argues should be taken seriously. In other words, natural beauty, the art, indeed, aesthetics does indeed extend beyond human art into the realm of nature in all sorts of ways. And that form of biotic art may in fact require a whole new language of art criticism, because we cannot obviously assume the same kind of human agency which we locate behind the production of human-generated art. Next slide, please. We're nearly there. Okay, what are the implications of this? A number of people, including another person who's written quite extensively on this field, Elizabeth Gross, teaches at a North American university, I can't remember which one. In her earlier work, she strongly equated aesthetics with sexual selection. In other words, the purpose of art was to select an attractive mate, okay? And I think, although Darwin himself had pointed this out long ago, I think she mixes up two things there. One was sexual selection with erotics, which is a much wider concept than simply sexual selection. Because after art has been produced, it can in fact have strongly erotic qualities, which may or may not have anything to do with mate selection. For example, if I find a Matisse nude painting attractive for some reason, my looking at that painting is in no way connected to my looking for a mate, okay? It might drive her away, in fact, because she has different tastes of art from me. So why do you like this? I think it's horrible. Women don't really look like that, something like this, right? But nevertheless, she's a very important scholar in this field because, again, a quotation from one of her books called Chaos, Territory, and Art, published again fairly recently, only 4 years ago. Very interesting definition of art, again, if we try to define art. Art is the way in which life experiments with materiality or nature in order to bring about change. And so she sees it art is having a kind of teleological function here. But what I find very interesting about some of her work is the fact, of course, all art is based on some form of materiality. It involves the transformation of material in painting or sculpture, for example, or it involves the use of the body in performance or dance, for example, without which there are people who argue, of course, there can be an entirely conceptual art. This creates difficulties for some people because, of course, there's nothing to see, and a piece of purely conceptual art only exists essentially as an idea or as an expression of an idea which disappears with that expression. Now, to some extent, this is true of all performance. I mean, if I look at a painting, if I like the painting, I can go back to the art gallery tomorrow, right? Look at it again. I really love that picture. Who is this artist? I've discovered a new artist I really like. The painting is there, right? If I go to a dance performance, once the dance is over, it's over, right? There's no permanence to it. And the closest it could become to a form of permanence is if it's been filmed, for example, or there are various not very successful forms of dance notation which enable future choreographers to reconstruct the dance from those notes. It looks a bit like musical notation, but it's a little different, of course, to something else. But with purely conceptual art, of course, there isn't any physical expression of this. But one of the virtues of her work, as I think, is that she does point to this of materiality and the fact that we like constantly to experiment with material to find out different things that we can do with it, which is, in a way, is actually quite a good definition of art, experimenting with material to see what we can do with it. She goes on to point out that if we think of art in this way, it also refreshes a link between aesthetics and ethics, that although these might be seen as totally separate categories, they're not. In fact, there are links between them, particularly because if, in fact, we understand animals to be not only beautiful, but as creators of beauty, this means that we have a responsibility towards nature, recognizing it as full of fully sentient entities. We're not the only creatures with minds, with language, who experience suffering and things like this. This is a quality of large areas of nature as such, okay? And so things in nature can be, of course, both objects of aesthetic appreciation, but also agents. They themselves are producing visual, oral, sensory value, not just those kind of things that economists like to talk about, you know, ecosystem services and things like this, right? So in fact, we may be on the verge here of understanding that aesthetics does indeed go way beyond art in the purely human created sense. Now we're almost at the end, so can we have the next, I think last slide? Is there one more? Or... Oh no, two more, sorry, two more. No, sorry, can we go back to the previous one? James Bridle, another interesting scholar I would alert you to if you're interested in this kind of field, is the work, I think he's British, has produced a book called Ways of Being, just again, very recent book, 2 years ago. Has an interesting subtitle, Animals, Plants, Machines, the Search for Planetary Intelligence. And in that book, he talks about, again, our relationship to animals. Do animals have language? Do animals suffer? Do plants have language, and do they suffer? Which, if they do suffer, it's a problem for vegetarians, of course, because they don't know what we're going to end up eating. But he extends the argument into interesting fields such as machines, machine intelligence, and AI. Can we, in fact, imagine sentient machines in the future with which we will have to establish some kind of relationship, rather like the relationship which we now think we should create with other animal species? Now, that's still a hypothetical situation, but maybe one that is close, you know, with AI becoming now a major agent in itself in our world. We're going to have to think about how we confront this, not only ethically and technically, but also potentially aesthetically. For example, one of the ways in which that has been discussed already with the question of digital art. If I program my computer to produce art, print it out, stick it on the walls of a gallery, is this in any way comparable to art which I produce by my own immediate agency, for example, painting on a piece of canvas, which of course itself is a material act, right? Using paint, canvas, whatever other elements I'm using to this. And just a quotation from his book, from the same book, which I thought summed up very much his ideas that are found in the book. We share, we're talking about animals and plants, right? Particularly, we share a world. This shared world is not flat or singular. Many worlds, lively, noisy worlds exist. Many don't include us at all, which is maybe a nice idea about human exceptionalism, right? Experience with plant hearing suggests that, unsurprisingly, in many of those worlds, the footsteps of caterpillars matter more than classical music or human language. This decentering and admission that the human race is not the only game in town does not correspond to any reduction of our world. Rather, as we extend the virtue of intelligence to other beings, the addition of plant worlds to our own enriches both. Even those worlds in which we do not participate add beauty to the totality of sensations and experiences that form the living, teeming earth on which we live and depend. That kind of sums up his whole book. I would strongly recommend it. It's a very beautifully written book. So I think one more slide, please, the final one before I shut up and allow Professor Munshi some space to try some concluding thoughts. Okay. I'm suggesting here that we can think about aesthetics as signaling another level of ecological and ontological interdependence with the world. It's another way of relating to that world, and therefore signals responsibility. That is where the ethical question becomes part of the equation. As Richard Prudens suggests, I think, or is hinting, that we should not judge biotic art by the same standards as human art. It's probably much more complex, okay? I mean, the difference between a painting of a tree and the real tree is amazing. And the closer you get to the real tree, you really imagine this is an amazing art form in itself, a piece of life, okay, which no human art could actually reproduce in anything like the same quality as nature has done very successfully. We, of course, as humans, view art as something which is expressed, right? Something which we express. In fact, we often talk about it that way, expressive art and this kind of stuff. My own university here, we have courses in expressive art, okay? But for animals, I don't think they're thinking about this. It's part of their integral nature. You know, a spider doesn't, I think get up in the morning, think, what sort of web shall I make this morning? You know, should it be this shape, that shape? It's integral to its nature. And I think if we think of art in this way, of biotic art in this way, we understand this to be part of a high level of intelligence, which is different from that of humans, but equally can be justified as being, in fact, considered intelligence. We cannot live without natural beauty, as we've suggested. And in fact, it's a way of thinking about science. Often science and aesthetic science and nature, in this sense we're talking about it now, are seen as something separated. Science, in the Francis Bacon sense, divides, it cuts up, it dissects. Aesthetics puts things back together. Is kind of false distinction, actually. A lot of science actually is about natural beauty. It's about probably our attempt to understand, rightly or wrongly, how that natural beauty is constructed, and in some cases not very successfully. Astronomy, for example, is a wonderful example in which we have almost no way of intervening in planetary worlds beyond our own, but yet it's a major source of beauty. It's something we go and gaze at. We love to see the sun rising or setting. We love to see the moon. We love to see stars. We love to see all these things, right? Although we cannot affect it in any obvious way, okay? It's clearly part of our wider experience of what shapes, what gives form to the universe. And I think if we do, in fact, study biotic art, it's a way of exploring the life worlds of other than human entities and their modes of interacting with their environments and with other beings, how they signal, how they attract one another, how they do all sorts of things which may have their parallels with the kind of role of art in human society, but may go beyond that in ways which I think enrich our understanding of the environment to something which is not just purely biological, botanic. It's also very much aesthetic. So that last idea, which Ananta referred to earlier on, of deep aesthetics. Aesthetics is including, but also going beyond the human. And that is essentially what the notion of bioaesthetics refers to. And I think it's a very, very significant way, which still requires a huge amount of research, thinking, and investigation, but does alert us to an approach to reality, which is, in fact, profoundly enriching. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, John, for your multidimensional and very comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. Now, Professor Munshi, please. And Professor Munshi might take 5 to 10 minutes. After Professor Munshi, John, if you like, you can please offer some rejoinder, or you can collect a few more thoughts, and we would continue with our exploration. So Professor Munshi, please.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
All right. First of all, many thanks, Professor Clammer, for an extremely interesting presentation. And I'm going to comment on some of the points that you have raised, though I must say, and I apologize in advance for presenting very unsystematic ideas to you, partly because I was asked by Anant practically at the last minute to make the comments. I couldn't say no because the theme interested me, and also I can never say no to Anant. Now, coming very quickly to the substance of the presentation, Professor Clammer, you have taken us through an extremely interesting topic, through human-animal relations, aesthetics, the debate so far, aesthetic experiences, different modes of it, and so on and so forth. And in doing that, I find two principal issues are involved. One concerning aesthetics and the other concerning ethics. As far as aesthetics are concerned, there are multiple issues. One, aesthetics, is it biologically rooted? Two, do non-human species have a sense of beauty? Three, animal aesthetics, is it analogous to human aesthetics? I think these are critical questions, and these have been raised. Some answers have been attempted. You have drawn from multiple concepts, of course, bioaesthetics, and you have also drawn from biotic art compared with human and environmental art, shared world, deep aesthetics, and integral creativity. The two books principally that you have drawn from, Prudens, his existing Evolution of Beauty, influential book, and Brodell's Shared World. And you have presented it in such a way that you have made a compelling case for thinking through and reimagining human-animal relationship. And this was what attracted me to this talk initially as well. My comments very briefly are as follows, that as far as animal ethics is concerned, in this, I think what we need to understand is, as far as aesthetics is concerned, I think what we have to also ask ourselves is that with the move that we have made from ethnographic attitude, ethnographic attitude of the kind which was ethnocentric, anthropocentric attitude, now if we have moved to the shared world and come to deep aesthetics, I think that's a move in anthropology that we can indeed welcome. And the question here will be, if we operate with the concept of integral creativity, which I think is critically valid to keep in mind, the point is to what extent non-human animals with their integral creativity can be compared with humans who perhaps have less restrictive creativity. And I'm not saying it to belittle animal creativity, but I'm trying to say that we need to see both convergences as well as differences. And here, I think it may be important to keep in mind that not all peacocks evolve or made or appear similar. One peacock's tail might be more interesting or more attractive than the tail of another peacock. In other words, there are variations even within integral creativity, or more variation than what integral creativity might lead us to believe. And the other point that I would like to ask is, as a sociologist, that in asking ourselves to what extent is creativity biologically rooted, and paying attention to bioaesthetics, we need also to keep in mind that everything is not biological. Though biologically rootlessness is not what I'm pleading for, but I'm pleading for also impact of culture, broadly understood, and try to suggest that cultural anthropology as a domain that needs to be defended and kept in mind. And here, if I could broadly hint at the following, that this issue of shared world, which is an extremely interesting concept, where we must keep in mind that there was a social anthropologist, Radhakamal Mukherjee. Anant made reference to him. I presented a detailed article on him recently, where he talked about a web of life, and much of what may come under shared world, I think he anticipated it in his book Social Ecology, which was perhaps one of the first books to appear on the theme under that title. It may be worthwhile for us all who are interested in seeing these connections to look at Radhakamal Mukherjee, much neglected also in India, his writings. The second theme that has come up is ethics, and quite quickly, here, Professor Clammer, the responsibility and rights, human responsibility and animal rights have come under discussion. You have raised it at different points, and very rightly so. I think what we have to ask ourselves even more urgently is how can we make it a pressing issue in a world which does not pay, where the attention span is limited, and the focus seems to be on greater focus on less significant things and less focus on more significant things. How can we make this entire issue of ethical responsibility of human beings towards non-human animals and their rights, how can we make it a pressing issue? And how can bioaesthetics contribute this an urgent practical issue? Who can be the trigger, the carriers of this idea? Artists, philosophers, others, feminists. I talk of feminists here because in terms of mate selection, which Darwin had emphasized, one must remember that it's not just a matter of male privilege, but also female privilege that mate selection take place. Because if it were not so, peacocks wouldn't have colorful tails and nightingales will not sing so nicely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Munshi. Now, John, would you like to immediately share some thoughts or wait for other comments?
Maybe just a very, very brief response. Thank you. I've noted your thoughts, Professor Munshi. Thank you so much. It's such late hour. I warn you, Ananta does this, so be careful. That's very kind of you to respond. I mean, your points are well taken. And indeed, many people in environmental ethics now are talking about, particularly philosophers are talking about, in fact, the fact that there are plenty of good ideas floating around. The question is now to operationalize them and turn them into policy or practice, which is actually going to affect positively, our relationship to the environment, given climate change and these kind of questions. I think key to what you said too is really this question of creativity. And I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, even if creativity is biologically rooted, I couldn't really care less. What is interesting is the creativity and the way it appears, and the way it appears in so many different forms. And I think you're totally right about this. The danger of retreating into a kind of biological, what we call it, determinism or reductionism is dangerous, is always dangerous. Like in any kind of ecological study, that is always a risk. And I think I'm very aware of that as well. I've noticed your other points, so thank you so much. But I would like to give space for, I know we only have about 10 more minutes, for anyone else to jump in who would like to. Thank you so much.
So thank you. Now we request friends to kindly share their thoughts. Randhir, you can please coordinate this session of our question answer, please. And you can kindly invite our participants, those who ask a question, they can put it in the chat box or so. Kindly, Randhir. Thank you.
Okay. Friends, you are requested to share some of your reflections or a brief comments or question. So we can invite Professor Meera Chakrabarti, and then we can invite Dr. Christian Bartolf. You may also write your question or comment in the chat box. Yes, Dr. Christian Bartolf.
Thank you for your lucid lecture and comments. I have two questions, precise questions to make it short. One is Jagdish Chandra Bose and his work on plant perception. Is it relevant? Is it worth reading again? And are there any conclusions for bioaesthetics. And the other is a new author, Harry Roman, Choreographies of the Living, Bioaesthetics and Literature, Art and Performance from 2018. Is there any inspiration for your work? Thank you so much.
Shall I reply one by one?
No, we
Or
may
shall we collect several?
collect.
Okay,
we may
thank
collect
you.
some.
Thank you, Christian. And thank you very much for, let me make a note of that, or if I will forget. Good to see you again. Thank you for coming. Yes.
Rowan.
Yeah, good evening. And yeah, I see so many people that I know here. Father James Panaya is currently the head of the Department of Christian Studies, University of Madras, my alma mater. So thank you for your presentation, Doctor. I'm afraid that I joined this conversation a little late, but I did do a course on animal voice a few years ago. And in that course, we spoke about voice as a political category. So it was like, it was from Aristotle that this tradition of privileging human speech. So speech, Aristotle says, is something that initiates us into the polis, whereas voice, which animals and humans possess, it is not political. So that kind of dichotomy gave rise to a lot of other problems that emerged in the Western context for a long time, which is now passed over to other contexts as well. I think we've borrowed a lot from that. And but then when we look at voice and we look at the pathos that comes with voice, we can also look at human art vis-a-vis animal art or animal, I think Nietzsche said something very interesting here. He said that organisms are not fundamentally out there to struggle for survival, but they are there to display their beauty, their magnificence, their fullness. And he was, as you know, Nietzsche is an aesthetist. So he sees the aesthetic dimension of animal art in the way they live their life. Their lived world is, a work of art in itself. So in that sense, they are artists, and the way and art and life go hand in hand. And so I'm sorry, I'm being a little all over the place, but I'm trying to weave a thought here. So so in that sense, when we meditate upon animal art, we realize that demeaning them to the category of just extended beings is fundamentally flawed. So I think that in that sense we can actually lend some political, animals can claim some political power in our human world as well. So, thank you.
Thank you.
So Father James, would you like to share some of your reflection?
Randhir, you can also invite Professors Nirmal Bamani. And one request is that, if possible, John and friends, we might take 10 more minutes if there is a little more interest. Is it okay, John?
For me, that's perfectly fine. Yes.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, thank you. So just I have a small question to John, namely the role of transcendental, in the aesthetics, we have covered different dimensions of aesthetics. So how does the transcendental play a role, not only in the life of humans, but also in the life of plants and animals? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I request Professor Nirmal Selvamani from Global Jindal University to share some of his reflection.
Thank you, Randhir, Professor Ananta, Professor John Clammer. It's wonderful to listen to Professor John again after many years. we did collaborate on a project in aesthetics some years ago. And I just want to recall something connected with that again, probably, if that's going to be relevant here. This idea of shared world, which has come up, in the observations of the others before me, that's really what, has been my passion for a very, very long time. I would call that a Tinai, which is a world in which, humans and beings other than humans are all members making a home, a family. So if we can think of, animals and birds and plants as part of our family, I think our ideas of anything that's connected with that family, like, for example, art or the question of politics or economy or anything, might be very different. The questions that we raise about them and how we want to think about them will, I think, look different. Because as someone before me pointed out, that we often discuss all of these with some assumptions, like, for example, what a human is. Like, this is something that John mentioned in his presentation. So our idea of human is, as somebody pointed out, is quite, if not Aristotelian, it goes even before Aristotle. It's a kind of a Western idea of a human as something very distinct, very, very different, quite unlike the other beings in the world, and so on. And now it's kind of represented as anthropocentrism. I don't think, it's centering here, because we need to think of all of the whole web of life as a family. I think then our thoughts on art might be quite different, because what is art? Probably the fundamental question is, what is art itself? Somebody says it's communication. Is it just communication? Or is it a way of being? Is there anything special at all, about art? So these are some of the basic questions I think we might ask if we think of a human and the world where the human is located in a different way. So I don't know whether I'm making sense, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe we can invite Shaka Makainu. As he's taking some time. Minati Pradhan, and then we'll invite Rama Sharma.
Yeah, thank you, Randhir. Thank you so much, Professor John Clammer. It is always been a pleasure to listen to him, actually. I have been lucky enough to listen to him so many times. As usual, it was a very deep presentation. When I was listening to him, I was just thinking about the book, The Secret Life of Plants, by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird. They have written. That was a fascinating account of the physical, emotional, and spiritual relationship between plants and animals. It talks about the radiant energy, memory, ability to communicate, the philosophies, and the progressive farming methods. But that time, actually, it was criticized for its pseudo-scientific claims. But given that account, if time is there, I'll just share few my raw experiences, how, without any scientific proof, these things work. In Odia, we have one proverb, you should not allow the weaver to cut the bamboo. They say they will get scared, they will not grow straight, or they will grow short, like that. So when childhood, I just listened to these things. I was just thinking, whether really does it work? I mean, like, really it works or not. So slowly, when I came into contact with this and reading many articles and going to these things, that it really works. And one more thing also, I just want to share, because how it really works, there is no proof, but it really worked. My grandfather-in-law, he was a centenarian. He had one nagkesar, I don't know what is that called in English, that tree to planted at home, and it was very, very young one. He always go and say that it should flower should come before my death. I want to see the flower in this. Means surprisingly, it had only 3 to 4 flowers before it matured. After he passed away, after 12 years of that, means it really matured and it bore the flowers. So from that, that is my very, very personal and intimate account. Like, we have witnessed it really plants do listen to the communications, and they do. So I don't have any questions. So I want to know whether from that book, it's the scientific Secret Life of Plants. It has been long published, 1973, like that. Whether now also, I want to know whether anything has been done to counter that criticism, like that sort of scientific claims, they always used to claim that it's not true. So whether anything has been done in that sphere. So that is what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Rama Sharma, and then we can invite Sudha Reddy.
Thank you so much, sir, for the wonderful knowledge you have given to us. I just have one question. Although I haven't read about this topic specifically, but one thing I want to ask that is that artificial intelligence or technologies are being used in animal industry or even in plants. It's very formulate. It is being used right now. So does it affect relations between human and animal? Is this the technology as it is doing more intense in this field? Does it really helpful? This I just want to ask about this.
Thank you. Sudha Reddy.
Hello, John. It's nice to hear you. I mean, it's always something very exceptionally unique when John takes up any theme. And obviously, this also gives me a kind of, very deep, it's a thought-provoking, and it helps me a lot to think further. There's no question, but I started looking this from whether it's from the ecofeminist perspective, whether can we look it from it's a feminine perspective. When it comes to the entire thing, it looks like that for me. And of course, there are certain things beyond, no doubt, beyond human. So I don't say eco-feminine, it's more of a feminine than the feminist. The problem when it comes to again, and it should not be anthropocentric. And then I was also thinking, like, how the spider is so beautiful. I mean, the way it, the creativity, the spontaneous creativity, it was coming to my mind. And then, of course, that is how we even philosophically we brought that the interconnectedness, interdependence. Donna Macy has brought out beautifully that, what is that? It's a web of life, but actually it's an interconnectedness. It shows. So I think whether we derive that kind of a concept from understanding from this spider's natural, creative work. So there are many thoughts coming to my mind. And also, like, what's a shared world? shared world, of course, we have been using it so much, especially when it comes to the now presently with the climate change, ecological destruction, and that. But the more and more we are talking about these concepts, so it's just thoughts. So how to bring these, how to look at from which perspective, and mine I'm looking from the feminine perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I have 2 questions, and then I will invite Ananta to add on some more question. So I'm very much, although I'm a student of sociology, but I'm very much interested in understanding human nature. And when I read animal means developmental psychology, I find a very insightful understanding of what sort of nature, whether we have different human nature. Human nature is different from animal nature. How does embracing our true animal nature to contribute to both the human happiness and the well-being of plant, given that the notion that you have discussed, human exceptionalism. And then what extent should legal protections of personhood apply to non-human animals? And can we ever hope to get past our own biases when assessing the minds of other human beings? Thank you. Now I invite Ananta to have his question.
Yes, thank you, John, and very fascinating conversations. Now, with the possibility of biological reductionism, which is not the case that John is pleading for, that invites us to explore the field of the biocultural. And the field of the biocultural, as it ties to nature, also the question of James about the transcendental in the sense that how the bioaesthetic field needs to be understood in the context of biocultural nature and also divine understood in a very open way. And therefore, the second theme is that the whole question of shared world also is not bereft of the challenge of commensurability and incommensurability. And therefore, there are different ways of which seems incommensurable, but also is open to different pathways of commensurability with communication, with openness. The third thing is about cosmology. As Nirmal has suggested about a Tinai, not only worldview, but a cosmology. Your own teacher, Evans Pritchard, when he talks about the newer human as simultaneously bird and the man, So therefore, in that way of being human, whether that cosmology and anthropology of human, which includes a dimension of bird, for example. The fourth is literature, because we have a very deep tradition of literature with the animals, like the Jataka tales and others, and how the study of these Jataka tales and the literature involving man-human also is a way to think about. And the final thought about bioaesthetics and biohappiness, Professor Swaminathan, whom you have met many years ago, wrote a very important book called Biohappiness. And your own suggestion about health and well-being, which is not just reduced to human utilitarianism, but there's a very interesting way to think about connection between bioaesthetics and biohappiness. In Swaminathan, it includes both cultural diversity and biodiversity, and this also would include biodiversity in a very deep sense of creating an environment for fostering multiple ways of biocreativity?
Now, John, over to you.
Okay, I think we lost Ananta anyway for a minute. Well, thank you. Let me try to briefly, I think in a way, Nirmal beautifully summed up what we're talking about anyway. Right? You remember what he said, the web of life kind of issue. But specifically, thank you, first of all, Christian, thank you. Subhash Chandra Bose, I'll really have to think about, I've never thought of that. I will pursue that. Carrie Rohan's book on choreographies of the living, yes, I'm very familiar with.
Jagdish Chandra Bose.
Yeah.
Bose.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
Jagdish
The
Chandra
Bose,
Bose, I think.
the Bose Institute. And
yes, the science, yes, that Chandra. I will look into that. The question about animal voice is interesting because I think that's where this question of rights, of course, is coming up. Whether in fact other entities, in our world, in fact, have agency, and so far as they have agency, they should indeed be participants in the, in fact, the broader political process. Again, a rather radical idea. I'm sure they don't teach us in political science departments. This would be quite a surprise, I think, if I think back to any of my old political science courses, if you brought up this kind of issue. But I think this now is a real issue, and as more than one person point out, of course, climate change, the kind of ecological crisis is, potentially enormously damaging, even civilization ending. But it perhaps forces us to rethink some of these very fundamental categories. Ideas that we've lived with for years and just taken for granted, that politics is about humans, end of story, human institutions, government in the classical way and all those kind of things, now are up for rethinking. And so I think this whole debate pushes us in that direction, which is extremely important and valuable. They should do this, including, James, as you point out, the question of kind of transcendence and what this points to, a more than human world, not in that reductionist sense, or we're just animals, that kind of thing, but to a much more, how should I put it, comprehensive how do I phrase this? Okay, if we start to think of this issue, or what this issue points us to, is realizing that we have other intelligent beings in our world. There's that fullness of being. There are all those things happening. I think this does fundamentally change the way in which we look at the world, and that itself has ethical implications because it changes the way in which we therefore have to relate to those beings. And that itself, I think, is, again, potentially very, very positive. It does make environmental ethics, a really key question that emerges absolutely naturally out of the way in which we understand the world, not in instrumental or utilitarian terms, but as precisely as this kind of shared world. Minati, there are lots of interesting work going on. Which I think extending those kind of ideas. Whether all of the ideas in The Secret Life of Plants, I also read it years ago. I can't remember all the details now. The kind of work I pointed out about people now looking at the way in which plants can detect predators, the way in which trees signal to one another, all this kind of thing does suggest, in fact, there's a much bigger scientific model emerging than was allowed previously by the kind of rather reductionist mechanistic understanding of science, has gone. I think this is pushed from other ends too, and feels like quantum physics and so on have already begun to push things in the direction of a much more subtle and willingness to understand that other entities can in fact be agents in the way in which was previously not admitted. They were not agents, they were simply entities out there which they could be experimented on, studied, dissected, whatever. I think that move, that rather primitive view is receding now, I think. And Rama, your point therefore about, so I think this is actually going to be the challenge. Clearly you can use technology, AI and so on, as a very powerful tool for investigating all sorts of aspects of nature, which previously required vast amounts of time and computation and so on, if we think of it that way, rather than something which then becomes another mechanism for dominating nature in new ways. And a lot of this debate about AI and so on, I find a little scary, not because of the stressful issues about, will robots displace all our work and all that kind of stuff, but in a slightly deeper sense, which is that, as a number of commentators pointed out, if kind of so-called superintelligence arises, will this in fact become a way of restructuring our understanding of the world, of the universe, in such ways that in fact are actually basically anti-nature? It becomes a technologized image of the world rather than an organic one. That's, I think, an issue we're going to actually have to confront, collectively, all of us will have to do this. Sudha, you didn't have a question as such, but I think your point and Randhir's point and Ananta's point, that they all flow together in a sense, which is to understand that if we have a broader idea of what constitutes the world in which we live, the cosmology, if you like, it's profoundly enriching, because it now enables us to relate in fresh ways to all sorts of entities that we regarded simply as things we used. That I think begins to disappear. It has the ethical implications we talked about before, which, if we understand we are part of a much more, we are simply one of the parts of a complex living system, and that the way we behave towards that living system obviously affects our long-term well-being. This would perhaps help us to behave a little better towards it. And indeed, ideas which used to be around in anthropology, which kind of went out of date a little bit. I don't know if they went out of date, they've sort of disappeared a bit. Interestingly, the discussion of animism has come back into anthropology quite a big way in the last few years. Okay, and I found this very, very interesting. If you read the older literature on animism, of course, it's regarded as a kind of rather stupid idea. There are spirits, living trees in rocks, in waterfalls, and so on, and all this kind of stuff. This is just a kind of pre-modern kind of intelligence. I think that view has been radically undermined by rethinking of the nature of animism. Indigenous knowledge about nature, indigenous ecological systems, all of these things have reemerged as real subjects, not only for study, but because they do point us actually to this bigger ontology. And I think that is the critical question. Grasping that ontology as being part of this living system, this web of life, is the key to transforming not only thought patterns, but also behavioral patterns in relation to, achieving genuine sustainability for ourselves and indeed future generations.
Thank you. Now I request Minati ji to offer vote of thanks.
Thank you. I, Minati Pradhan, on behalf of Swadhyaya, Sahachakra and the Vishwaneedam Center for Asian Blossoming, would like to thank our today's chief speaker, Professor John Clammer, as usual, for his very deep and enlightening presentation. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. I also thank Professor Munshi for his valuable insights and opinions. Thank you so much, sir, being part of our today's webinar. We are also deeply enriched by the presence of Dr. Christian Butterf, Father James, Professor Nirmal Selvamani, Meera Ma'am, Sudhadi, and Dr. Rama Sharma. I thank all of you from the bottom of my heart, and I also thank Rohan and other participants. And I also thank the people who have joined us in our Facebook platform and YouTube platform. Thank you all. Please pardon me if I've forgotten anybody's name, but I thank all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming.